Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. Human trafficking is modern-day slavery and the human rights issue of our lifetime, affecting the vulnerable, poor, and oppressed around the world. Dr. Celia Williamson, Director of the Human Trafficking and Social Justice Institute at the University of Toledo in Ohio, will give us an overview today of trafficking in the U.S. and around the world, including the process of trafficking, indicators to identify victims and traffickers, and how to report it. Rather than continuing to shoot the wounded with quick fixes or less than best practices, Dr. Williamson advocates for meaningful interventions at the individual and system levels. These can interrupt this practice, create collective change, and transform the way we think about trafficking, from a rescue and restore mission to a matter of human rights. Right now, I have everyone on mute to avoid background noise. We welcome you to enter any questions or comments you have for Dr. Williamson in the questions box throughout the presentation. She will answer any questions at the end as time permits. Dr. Celia Williamson is a professor and director of the Social Work Master's Program at the University of Toledo. She also recently opened the Human Trafficking and Social Justice Institute to further combat human trafficking through research, education, and engagement. Dr. Williamson has been engaged in anti-human trafficking work for more than 25 years, having founded the first anti-trafficking program in the state of Ohio in 1993 and directly working with victims in Toledo for several years. She has completed numerous federally funded studies, written several articles and reports, and edited 2 books on sex trafficking around the world. In addition, she founded the annual International Human Trafficking and Social Justice Conference and has delivered over 200 presentations at various conferences and events. Celia, we thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your insights on this important topic. Now I will turn it over to you. 1 minute, please.
Thank you. Okay, can we see that hopefully?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, so I'm just going to jump in to what is human trafficking. Human trafficking is known around the world as modern day slavery. Men, women, and children are bought for either sexual services or labor services or both. It's known to be the second largest criminal industry in the world and the fastest growing. So there are 3 criminal enterprises: illegal drugs, illegal guns, and human trafficking. And so human trafficking, you can sell your product over and over and over, and that's why it's growing so fast in popularity around the world. In the US, we passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000, and that was our first acknowledgement that we may have these slaves on US soil. And so under the federal law, sex trafficking is anyone who recruits, harbors, transports, provides, or obtains a person for commercial sex act, in which that sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. So if you're an adult and you're involved in the commercial sex trade and you're there because of force, fraud, or coercion, then you're the victim of the crime of sex trafficking. Or in the US, if you have not yet reached the age of 18, under the federal law, you are a victim of sex trafficking if you're involved in the commercial sex trade. So if you're a young person under 18, we don't need to prove force, fraud, or coercion. Your involvement means that you are a victim, and we need to give you services and not incarceration. Before 2000, that was not the case. We incarcerated our teens who were involved in prostitution. Labor trafficking is also the recruitment, harboring, transporting, providing, and obtaining a person for labor or services through which there's force, fraud, or coercion, and it's for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, and slavery. So around the world, the Global Slavery Index estimates that there are about 40.3 million slaves in the world today. We estimate, it's an old stat, not as reliable statistic, but the U.S. State Department estimates that 600 to 800,000 people are trafficked around the world from country to country, and that there are about 17,000 victims that may be brought into the U.S. and sold into the sex or the labor markets course, the Global Slavery Index, who just did their study in 2018, said that number is about 403,000 people that are brought into the U.S. The U.S. has a campaign called Look Beneath the Surface, so where we ask people to assess, to know the red flags and identify potential victims that may be coming in for services for healthcare, social services, clinical counseling, all those types of services. So I just want to focus on labor trafficking first and sort of do some awareness around that. Labor trafficking in the U.S. is domestic servitude, people working in people's homes for little or no pay, commercial cleaning, sweatshops, factories, people begging and peddling, agricultural, candy and magazine sales have been connected to domestic minors involved in selling candy and magazines that have to give that money to traffickers. Restaurants, food services, beauty salons, also hair braiding places, nail salons, manual labor carnivals, landscaping, working in hotels and hospitality, and then around the world, also those things going on. In addition, some countries have child soldiers, kids working in brick kilns, people and children working as fishermen, having to fish. And the thing about labor trafficking is you are not allowed to quit. You are in fear for your life, for your family's life, and you're getting paid little to nothing. In almost every labor trafficking case, there's a debt bondage system. And so people that are victims have to pay back their trafficker for the expenses of sending them to another country or their living expenses, survival expenses. And so those amounts of money are usually way too high. That victim can never be able to pay that money back. And so, if you're getting $50 a week and you're working 7 days a week, and your debt is $10,000, it's set for you to never be able to pay that back, because out of your weekly money, you also have to pay for your living expenses. So in the U.S., we have a T visa. So if we identify victims in the U.S., they can receive this T visa, and legal services, social services, healthcare, housing, and also their family can receive protective care if they're in another country and they're under threat. Those family members in that other country can be brought to the U.S., or they can receive services in their country of origin. So in labor trafficking, we always ask that people try to buy fair trade if they can, because fair trade is really your guarantee around the world that everyone along that supply chain, from the guy picking cocoa beans in the field, have been paid a fair wage. And so in America, we like to get the best deal. And so we like to buy the cheaper product, where fair trade usually costs a couple dollars more. But this isn't charity, and we're willing to give charity. This is empowerment. And so, let's think twice when we go in the store and the fair trade product is a couple dollars more. You're not giving charity, you're giving empowerment. You're ensuring, that's your guarantee, that everyone along that supply chain is getting paid a fair wage. So I also like to mention slaveryfootprint.org, which is a website that you can go to, and you can take the little survey, and it will tell you an estimation of about how many slaves worked for you today. Likely if you drank coffee or had sugar, you likely had some slaves work for you along that supply chain. So sex trafficking. Sex trafficking in the U.S. consists of stripping, lap dancing, pornography, massage parlor work, escort services, remote interactive sexual acts, online stuff, live sex shows, mail order brides, child brides. These also happen around the world, not just in the U.S., but these are some of the categories that fall under sex trafficking. A lot of people think that, well, first they think trafficking happens somewhere else in the world, and that's also true. in terms of around the world. Recruitment countries are typically those countries that are maybe third world countries where there's political unrest, maybe police corruption, not a stable economy. And the destination countries where victims are taken are usually first world countries that have a stronger economy and spend a lot of money on sexual services and want to get cheap labor. But human trafficking also happens in the US, and we have domestic minors or American youth that are also trafficked, particularly into the sex trade. And so when we watch the media, movies, television, we think of kids walking down the street and being snatched and chained and forced into sex trafficking, when it's really quite the opposite. Forcing and snatching and chaining it happens, but probably about 5% of the time. Manipulation about 95% of the time, where a trafficker and recruiters befriend a young person and then slowly manipulate them into a situation where they're then caught up and they don't know how to get out and they're afraid. So I, as a trafficker, would get my victim to participate in their own victimization with me. And when you think about trafficking being a business where supply is the victim and demand are the customers, if you think of it as a business, it's not feasible for me to go around snatching kids and chaining them and forcing them, because the police are going to be looking for that young person who just disappeared off the street out of nowhere. So I'm taking a lot of risk for a limited amount of yield. Whereas if I manipulate this kid into thinking I love them and they should love me, they think I'm their boyfriend or I'm their best friend, and I manipulate them into participating in their victimization with me, then I have low risk and I can make a lot of money over time. So we got to think of it as a business, because that's certainly what it is. Some of the red flags we're looking for when we think about identifying trafficking victims, we're looking for young people who may have a significant change in their behavior. Maybe they avoid answering our questions. Sometimes young people are trafficked around different cities, so sometimes they can't even tell you the city they might be in right now. They lie frequently. We know a child lies 3 to 5 times about who they are or what they're involved in, because they've been trained to lie. They have a lot to protect. They're afraid. And so we expect to hear those lies, that those lies don't really connect. They don't really add up. It's going to give you a funny feeling in your stomach, like something is wrong. The child may be looking to another person, an adult, to answer, maybe looking at the floor, giving them all the power, and that is going to make you think about what's going on here. And maybe you've seen it before, but you didn't have the term, you didn't know how to label it. Or this child seems coached, or maybe they're using terms like a trick or being in the life or being in the game. Those are kind of language that's used in trafficking. Or maybe that child seems preoccupied, or maybe they seem promiscuous. If you're a healthcare professional, maybe they have a lot of sexually transmitted infections, but maybe they're not promiscuous. Maybe they have to comply with the demands of someone else. Some physical indicators, there's a lot of them here. I'm not going to read them all, but and alone, they probably don't add up to much. But when you take the behavioral, when you take the emotional, the physical indicators, and you start to put them together, it kind of paints a picture that should make you uncomfortable. And now you have a label that this might be human trafficking going on. So young people or adults with multiple cell phones, large amounts of cash, maybe they evidence that they've been traveling, maybe they have a tattoo or branding on their body that is the name of their trafficker or their pimp. Maybe they have no ID, or the other person is holding or controlling their IDs. Maybe they have unaddressed medical issues that have been chronic. Maybe there are multiple children present with an unrelated male. Maybe they have a hotel room key or hotel room key card, ads online. All of these things are indicators that something else may be going on. Sex trafficking or labor trafficking may be going on. Some of the other languages, sex trafficking particularly, that young people will call their trafficker or their pimp daddy. Other girls that are under the control of this pimp may be known as wife-in-laws to each other, or sometimes the trafficker will say, "This is my wifey." Now, wifey is not just exclusively, in trafficking. A wifey is also just a pop culture term that's also used. Being out of pocket is a lot of times used in trafficking, and being out of pocket means that you are breaking the rules, and there are many, many rules when you are involved under the control of a trafficker. And when you break the rule, you're known as being out of pocket, and that means I have the potential to lose money out of my pocket because of the way you're behaving. So that victim then would have to suffer physical consequences because of that. And it may not be beating them up with black eyes and broken ribs. It might, but it could also mean tying them up and making them sleep outside in the winter without clothes on or without a coat. Because sometimes traffickers are clever in that they don't want to leave any physical signs of abuse. So what are the victim's mindset or feelings, whether it's an international victim or a domestic victim, whether it's labor or sex trafficking? Victims most always feel shame. They feel humiliated. They feel, there's a difference between shame and guilt. Guilt is what you feel when you've done something wrong. Shame is what you feel when you are something wrong. When you've brought shame against yourself and shame against your family, that's almost unrecoverable in your mind. Maybe they're in denial. They think, yes, I've gotten myself into this situation, but I'm going to work hard and I'm going to pay my debt and I'm going to get myself out. Maybe they don't understand the culture of the country that they've been brought to, if it's international. Over time, victims very typically develop positive feelings and loyalty toward their trafficker, because this is a phenomenon called trauma bonding and Stockholm syndrome, and we've seen it in kidnapping cases. It's very common where the victim has one dominant voice that they hear for a period of time, the trafficker's voice, and they begin to believe that voice. They begin to almost sort of trust in that voice, because if the person that is all powerful in my mind is happy and satisfied, then I get to keep breathing. And so it's a psychological phenomenon that the body and the mind does to survive. And so when police break in the door to rescue someone, they're not often happy to be rescued. They think the police have made a terrible mistake because this person is now going to go kill my family, or hurt my family, or go get my little sister and make her do what now I'm not able to do. And before Joe Cop can figure it all out, my family will be dead, or my family's house will be burnt down. And so they really don't want to tell you what's been happening in their lives, and that's some of the reasons why they aren't truthful. They aren't honest when they show up to your social service agency, or they show up in the emergency room and something looks very, very wrong, but they won't tell you. We know that in the US, the average age of recruitment into sex trafficking is about 14 to 15 years old. We also know that vulnerability is the common denominator across all trafficked youth, whether it's they have different neighborhoods and socioeconomic classes, races, ethnicities. Vulnerability is the tie that binds. That's really, vulnerability could be anything from being a prior abuse victim, child abuse or rape, maybe having, a parent that has a mental illness that hasn't been treated, then that child is going to be vulnerable. Or maybe that child is involved in substance abuse, or their parent is, or there's mental health issues, or they have problems in school. But it also can be two middle-class parents who have 3 children, and one child needs a little bit more love and attention, and that young person is vulnerable. And traffickers meet that vulnerability. That's what they do. That's why it's successful. They match that vulnerability. So if you're a young person who's a runaway or whatever, and you're looking for someone to love you, and a father figure, that person is going to step forward, or a mother figure, that woman is going to step forward as a recruiter, but she's going to step forward and try to fill that void that you have. And so that's what makes it really successful. Vulnerabilities, people say that anybody can be trafficked, and yes, that's true, but disproportionately, this is the list of people that are more likely to be trafficked, have a higher probability. Kids in poverty, kids involved in child protection or juvenile court, youth of color, minorities in the U.S. particularly, LGBTQ youth, homeless and runaway youth, substance abusing youth, youth that are foreign born, youth that have engaged in survival sex at least once. And so we call commercial sexual exploitation when kids are involved in having to trade sex with adults. And we call sex trafficking when there's a third party involved that is getting paid or benefiting from this transaction. But in our minds, commercial sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, those youth, no matter what, are vulnerable and need services. Youth with disabilities, youth engaged with antisocial peers, youth that would have a much older boyfriend. So if you see a young person who's 14 and her boyfriend's 27, that's going to be a red flag for you to look further. Gang-affiliated youth. So these, although any youth can be trafficked, for sure, these have a higher probability of being trafficked. There's a strong connection between drugs and trafficking. In the U.S., we have a opiate heroin epidemic going on, and so there's a strong connection that those folks are vulnerable because of their drug addiction and are being trafficked. Strong connection between runaway and trafficking. In the U.S., being a runaway is the #1 risk factor for trafficking. And the U.S. really doesn't have a response to runaways except to wait for them to run back. And so that's not really smart of us, but we need to have a good runaway plan. And yes, we have the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, but that police office, that parent has to know to call and want to call and elicit the help of the National Center. And we also have the National Runaway Hotline, but if that person is not in control, they don't have agency, they can't get to a phone to call someone. So we really don't have a good response in the U.S. besides some street outreach that someone may randomly connect with the runaway, but it's not a strategic response. Where are vulnerable youth recruited? Well, they're recruited in very open spaces like malls and high schools, and juvenile detention and group homes are where a lot of vulnerable kids are. And the recruiter is not the scary, creepy guy. It's going to be another girl, a 14-year-old girl, another 16-year-old boy. Online is booming with trafficking. And so it's not, young people aren't recruited in scary places, back alleys and seedy bus stations. They're recruited in very open, safe-looking places. And again, that's why it's been successful. Who recruits? Well, in the state that I live in Ohio, we've done a study, and girls are more likely to recruit other girls than it is boys and men. But boys, men, women who are a mother figure, or women who are that cool adult woman that you always wanted to hang out with when you were a teenager, girls, developmentally, young people want to belong. So they want to connect to a peer group and have a sense of belonging. So girls are recruited. Probably about 25% of boys in the US are also trafficked into the sex trade, so they can be victims as well. And then the recruitment process, the strategy is really manipulation, gifts and compliments, building the self-esteem, giving you a group to belong to, telling you you're beautiful, telling, some victim that you love them as in that's your new boyfriend. And then the seasoning period is the process of really breaking down that self-esteem and aiming to have complete physical and emotional control, even down to renaming that person, maybe giving them a street name or prostitution name, and creating this dependency on the trafficker for every single thing. And I don't know if you understand me when I say level of control. I mean, I might ask you, how many squares of toilet paper do I need to tear off because I have to go to the bathroom? I mean, the level of mind control. And that's why, we don't have to, that's why you don't see people chained and things like that, because once I control your mind, once I control your emotions, I don't need to physically chain you. You're not going to run off. You're too scared. You're too much in love with me as well. And you're not going to tell anybody what's happening either. So where are victims sold? They're street level prostitution, yes, but typically that's what we get back in our cities after our young people have been manipulated, sold, abused, raped, traumatized over and over and over again, suffer from complex trauma. What we get on our streets back is now someone who may be 27, 35 years old, addicted to drugs, because once you're raped, once you're sold, you can't go to counseling. You can't go to years of counseling to recover. What you can do is use drugs to treat your trauma. And so we see very drug addicted people back on the streets selling themselves for $10 or $20 worth of heroin. And those are sometimes the adult women that we feel justified driving by and saying, well, she shouldn't have took herself out on the street. But we have to remember that those are the kids that we missed. And for every kid we missed, there's a high probability that that's where they'll end up. We know 77% of the kids that we miss that are being trafficked will likely end up in street level prostitution, addicted to drugs, high HIV risk, frequent pervasive violence, poor mental health outcomes. So that's why it's so imperative that we identify victims early, get them into treatment, and hopefully they can recover. But we see victims sold at strip clubs, private dancing, massage parlors, online, at conventions, major sporting events. We always, a friend of mine does this intervention at Super Bowl every time and always recovers victims at Super Bowl by handing out, interestingly, bars of soap that have the hotline, the human trafficking hotline number on it. She puts those in hotels all around the Super Bowl, because that's one place that victims usually can go privately, is in the bathroom. And so when they use those soaps, they can call the hotline and be rescued. So sex trafficking is a business, I mentioned. The supplier, the victims, demand are the customers, but there's the traffickers. There's also the bottom, which is often the assistant manager of the business, and it's usually a female. She knows a lot about the business, and trains some of the victims to get out there and get the money effectively and efficiently. There are recruiters, groomers, security, connectors, watchers, and all these people play a role in dressing the victims, selling the victims, and making sure the victims follow the rules. So demand, who are the customers? Well, a lot of people like to think the customers are like the creepy guy living under the bridge, the pervert, but in reality, the premium product of a 14-year-old is fairly expensive. And so you see people that are employed, mostly men, that purchase sex. So here's a short list of people in various professions that we know through our research that have purchased sex trafficking victims for sex. They may have known it, they may have not known it, but they have been purchasing victims who do not want to be involved. Online is a big business, and teens are recruited online because they share their feelings and they share their vulnerabilities, and they say things like, I want to be loved. And they don't say it like that. They say, look at my selfie. Would you say it's beautiful? Give me compliments. Or they say, I'm lonely. And they don't use those words, but they talk about their human emotions. And traffickers get online and they respond to those human emotions. You need love? I love you. You're lonely? I'll be your best friend. You want to be treated as an adult woman? I'll treat you as an adult woman. And so they respond to those very fundamental needs that all people have, but young people in particular who are going through emotional times. So why don't victims seek help? A lot of people say, why don't victims just run off? And they have a fear of the violence, and maybe they feel shame or they blame themselves for getting into this situation. They're afraid of being arrested or incarcerated, particularly if they're from another country. They don't understand perhaps the law in that country or the law in the US. They don't understand that we wouldn't deport them if we found out that they were victims. Sometimes victims don't even trust law enforcement because maybe law enforcement has been a customer. They're caught up in their debt bondage and they have to pay that back. Maybe they've been promised that their lives will get better soon as if they just continue to do this. Maybe they don't understand the legal system, or maybe they've tried to escape before and it hasn't worked. So using a trauma-informed approach that recognizes the resilience of victims and is focused on human rights and is culturally sensitive, we have to figure out ways to say to potential victims, we're here to help you, that your safety is our first priority, and that we will give you the care that you need. And if you've been brought here against your will, that you will not be deported if that person is a foreign victim. Now, if we say those things or versions of those things, then we have to make sure that we become advocates to hand that person off to someone that can make sure that we do those things, because mistakes have been made where people have been deported and they shouldn't have been deported. So before we even talk about, what we can do to really help victims, we have to look at our systems, because we don't want victims to fall through the cracks, but how cracked are our systems? So we have to prepare those. We know our criminal justice systems have had inappropriate responses. We know that they've arrested the victims. Across the US, we've been passing safe harbor laws, and safe harbor laws basically say that child abuse or child trafficking is child abuse. Prior to that, we would arrest the child and stigmatize the child and not hold the adults accountable. And so if a 14-year-old was sold to a 37-year-old by a 47-year-old, we held that 14-year-old accountable. Today, hopefully we don't do that, because I think every state in the US at least, has passed some version of the safe harbor law. So now juvenile court is not the primary institution in that child's life, child protection is. But still, in our social service field, our trafficker has a victim 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and says, if you want a place to travel, if you want a group to belong to, if you want people who love you, yes, we'll beat you and sell you, but we've got you 24 hours a day. And in social work, which I'm a social worker, we're likely to say, well, come down for 2 to 4 hours a week of what we'll call intensive work, or we'll come to your home for up to 4 hours a week and do intensive work, or maybe you come in for an hour a week. We can't compete with that kind of model. But trafficker has someone's support, although very dysfunctional and abusive. Our support is a drop in the bucket. So we're circling the wagons, and they have nuclear capabilities, and we're wondering why we're losing the fight. The education system is teaching about the history of slavery and nothing about modern day slavery. That's changing now. across states and across school systems. Young people are beginning to get that human trafficking education. Healthcare, we know 87.8% of victims had contact with a healthcare professional while they were being trafficked. And sometimes those healthcare professionals recognized because they were educated. Sometimes they didn't recognize. They had a bad feeling. They didn't know how to name it. They sent the person back into their underground and dangerous world. And that's got to end, because healthcare is really the place that is a neutral zone. Social services, they might have had a past experience with a social worker. Maybe it didn't work out so well, and they have an opinion about social workers. Or maybe they have had experiences with police and they have an opinion about that. But healthcare facilities typically is a neutral place where someone comes and they follow exactly the orders of what the healthcare person said. And so there's a lot of power in that. There's a lot of opportunity in that. And so healthcare is really a good place to ask questions and start to identify victims. And in my community, we have a protocol where we educate healthcare professionals. They suspect that someone could be a trafficking victim, and then they call in the social worker, or they call in the sexual assault nurse or the charge nurse, who then does a more thorough assessment and connects that person to services. We know at child protection agencies across the U.S., they see sometimes child trafficking as a juvenile court issue. It's very expensive. It's very taxing for child protection to take on this issue. And so when they do take on this issue, they have to have the resources and the funding to support what they're getting ready to take on. I know in Ohio, we passed safe harbor law and said child trafficking is child abuse. And we are beginning to stress out our child protection agencies. And we've had in 2017 over 400 seasoned child protection workers quit. And they outlined 2 reasons: stress and vicarious trauma. So between our opiate epidemic and our trafficking issue, we are stressing out our systems, and we need a lot more resources in our states to be able to have them do the effective job that we're asking them to do. Foster care, we know that the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in 2017 said that 1 in 7 runaways were likely victims of child sex trafficking. And of those, 88% were in the care of social services when they went missing. We know that we have to change our perspective when we look at child abuse as child trafficking. And here's a list. I'm not going to go over all of it, but child abuse, we typically think of traditional child abuse, that when you're abused, you feel powerless. The child is not the seducer, the perpetrator is, and the child is withdrawn, and they usually keep it a secret. Whereas in child trafficking, the child may feel powerful selling themselves and having men purchase them. They have been trained to act as the seducer. It's usually not a secret. People in their little social circle may know what they're doing. So it presents itself differently, but it's still child abuse nonetheless. Hollywood has us romanticize prostitution and sex trafficking, as in Pretty Woman. Sometimes people eroticize it, as in Debbie Does Dallas, and some people distort it, as in the movie Taken. In the movie Taken, the first one, Liam Neeson has his daughter leave the country and then is trafficked. And that is a myth, because kids are being trafficked right here on the streets of the U.S. and basically around the world and in every country. The media distorts it. We have things like Cinderella, who, we sit our children down and we say, here, baby girl, learn your value as a woman. Now, we didn't say that, but that's what we implied when we sat our 3-year-old daughters down and said, watch Cinderella, because Cinderella was never happy until she married a man. And so then she lived what? Happily ever after. like we all do right now in our relationships. So Cinderella teaching daughters that you can only be happily ever after if you have a man in your life, I think is a scary message to send. Belle from Beauty and the Beast. She went to the castle. She did not like the beast. Not until she was held captive at the castle did she fall in love with the beast. We call that trauma bonding and Stockholm syndrome. They call it a love story. You decide. She also thought, I'm going to turn this beast into a beautiful prince. And we see that in domestic violence court every day as well. Sleeping Beauty, couldn't even move a muscle until a man came and kissed her. Without her permission, by the way. Today we would call that probably sex assault or at least inappropriate behavior. And then Ariel, whose home was in the sea. You remember Ariel gave up her home in the sea for her man. She also gave up her voice, which I think is a very dangerous political message for women to give up their voice. So you decide if you want to sit your children down and have them, boys and girls, and have them learn the value of a woman. Now this picture is Barbie, of course. I use it as a mugshot because who is this person who never works a job, has a waist so small that it would not support her big breasts. She would probably just topple over in half. But Barbie never does anything and has the Barbie camper, the Barbie car, all the clothes, beautiful makeup. And she tells people in the world that white and blonde and thin is the way to have beauty. So I think that's the wrong message to send as well. These are some commercials, as you see children being very sexual. This is about Beyonce's Put a Ring on It. Loves Baby Soft because innocence is sexier than you think. And when you see these things now, it kind of turns your stomach. Here's a rap video. So some of our responses to trafficking, we want to move victims to survivors to thrivers. And how we do that is with case management services, intensive wraparound services, trauma treatment therapy. Every victim of trafficking needs trauma treatment therapy, not just counseling, but trauma treatment. They need legal services. They need to feel safe. They need support groups. They need basic needs. So these are some of the things that social workers do and peer mentors who are also survivors do to help victims recover. We use a very trauma-informed care approach, and that's adoption of principles and practices that promote a culture of safety, culture of empowerment, of healing. And so trauma-informed care is the big buzzword of the day, but trauma treatment is a therapeutic modality done by a clinical counselor. And so those are two very different things. So we ask under the trauma-informed care model that we watch our language. We don't call children involved in prostitution juvenile prostitutes. We call them victims of sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation. We try not to stigmatize and blame the victim. We have to remember that it's the adult's responsibility. So we have a PATH model called Partners Against Trafficking in Humans, and we coordinate care among our entire community of service providers so that we know where our victims are going, what kind of services they're receiving. We assess them a lot to make sure that we are indeed moving victims to survivors and survivors to thrivers. So we've trained 900 professionals, 19 agencies. We receive data about what's happening with our victims, and we study that data and feed it back into our systems so that they can improve. This is a model that we'd be happy to talk about, to share if anybody is out there and thinking that they'd like to do something or they're involved in anti-trafficking work and they'd like to do more. We also have a prevention curriculum called Best Life Curriculum. It's a 10-topic curriculum. It just got cut down to 8 sessions because we've done research on what is working and not working. And so this is research-informed curriculum. It's moving toward a best practice or evidence-based curriculum. And So that's something that we also are willing to share. We have the oldest human trafficking conference in the nation. Our conference has been going on 16 years. It's held at the University of Toledo in Toledo, Ohio in the US. You can find out information about that conference at traffickingconference.com. Actually, our conference is coming up next month, September 19th and 20th, 2019. But if that's too soon for you to get everything together to attend, you can always join us. It's every September. We have about 80 presenters. We have about 2,000 attendees. We've had people come from 42 states in the US and 30 countries around the world to participate and present. I also produce a Emancipation Nation podcast, and I bring on guests every single week that talk about the things that they're doing in the anti-trafficking movement. So this podcast specifically focuses on what we do and how you can do it too. It's not a podcast that talks about what trafficking is so much and why it's important to get involved. It's really about what it is, why it's important, but focuses on what to do and how to do it. And so you can get that at Stitcher, at iTunes. It's on all the podcast outlets. You can also get it at my website. We also have a Global Association of Human Trafficking Scholars, and those are researchers all over the world that are coming together to collaborate and move the knowledge base forward. So if you're a researcher, feel free to please email me and get involved with the Human Trafficking Scholars. What you can do otherwise. I wanted to make sure that I gave you the National Trafficking Hotline, 888-3737, 888. If you have any suspicions, you don't have to give your name. You don't have to know their name. You just have to describe whatever it is that you know. And we always ask that you please take the chance, and maybe you're wrong, but it's okay. Take the chance and call the hotline and give them all the information, and they will contact the Department of Homeland Security if it's an international issue, or their FBI task force, or whatever local or state level task force they have there in your community. Educate yourself and your loved ones. Identify victims. Assess them, refer them to services. Join an anti-trafficking coalition that might be in your community. If you don't have one, you can form one, you can start one. Be educated, be trauma informed. And then, as a social justice leader, because this is indeed a social justice movement, be an evolved person. Try to appeal to your higher self when at all possible. Disobey the rules. Go in and set new rules. Focus on setting new policies, new agendas in your organizations so that they can start to address trafficking. Take action. If you have the chance at the mic or seat at the table, take it. Take that seat and talk about trafficking and what your organization might do to focus your efforts. Remove those unnecessary barriers. If you are shy, remove shy. Get it out of the way, so that you can begin to do the work that's so needed so that people that are enslaved can someday have freedom. And ask and persist. It's okay, be polite about it, but persist. Try to get those policies in place. Try to get your organizations to see that this is an important issue, and serve the mission. And our mission is freedom. Provide the solution. The revolution begins in the mind. When you educate other people, they will start to put things in place. They will start to open their doors and their hearts and their minds. So when we care, we can do almost anything. And this is why we do what we do. This is a visual timeline of the physical trauma. So I didn't even get to talk to you about the emotional trauma, the mental health trauma, but this is just a visual trauma of how we saw girls, and this isn't a book actually, but this is how we see them in the beginning, and then over time as they're trafficked, what happens to their lives. one trafficker said, with the young girls, you promise them heaven and they'll follow you to hell. And this is really hell. This is a book by Laura Coulter. So enough said. I just wanted to let you see the trauma that these aren't people just out in the world having a good time making money. These are highly traumatized victims. And so I'll stop there and just open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Celia, for this important information. I do have some questions from the audience. We've got about 10 minutes. So a couple attendees are asking about prevention strategies for professionals who are in contact with at-risk youth. Can you speak to the roles of, schools and churches and other community places like that, and what are the most effective ways to stop trafficking before it starts?
I think that one of the most effective ways is to understand who's at risk, and if we have limited time and resources, to really focus energies on those youth at risk. And so we see a lot of coalition members across the country going out and educating people all over the place, and they might go to the suburbs, to the church, and educate people, but that's not really where we need you. We need you where those kids are at risk, that list that I had in the earlier slide. That's where you need to be. And then going in and doing a, human trafficking 101, here's what it is. You can't walk away and then think that you've got that taken care of, because education doesn't always reduce risk. It's like you can have an educated person who's now at risk. You just came in and educated them about human trafficking. So I would connect them to human trafficking prevention curriculum that they have in schools, that they have in community centers. Connect them to that, because that's going to be more than a one dose, here's what human trafficking is, good luck, because that's not going to reduce the risk. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of programs that are evidence-based and best practice programs. So they're typically made up programs that people thought, well, this might be a good idea. Our prevention curriculum is being studied, and we just ran 52 kids through it, and we have the findings from that. So we are on our way to building an evidence-based prevention curriculum. But when you're looking at curriculums, I would ask those questions. Has this been studied? Is it effective? And if there's nothing else in your community, you'll have to trust and go with that. But hopefully, we'll have an online human trafficking curriculum training up very soon, within a matter of weeks. But, the other ones might be good. We just don't know it yet.
And so this training you're talking about does work across disciplines for example, law enforcement, social work, medical professionals, et cetera?
Oh, no, our curriculum is focused on youth. Youth are the participants in the program. For adults, human trafficking overview, human trafficking training, one-on-one work, there are lots of those trainings out there, and they're all, I would say most all of them are pretty good when we're talking about educating professionals, because professionals, they can get it pretty quickly. So if someone needs to be connected to a particular training, or they want a training to be brought, I can do it online for sure, but I can also likely connect someone in their community with someone that's already doing the training, just because we're pretty fairly connected across the US anyway, and in some places around the world. So we can certainly connect you, just email me.
Okay, great. And you talked about runaways being a particularly vulnerable group to trafficking, and that the US and probably most other countries in the world don't really have very effective runaway plans. Could you speak briefly as to what that kind of plan would look like, in your opinion?
Yes, in my community, we are working with the sheriff's office, and the sheriff's office will be getting names every single week, going out using officers to look for runaways, and those runaways will immediately be connected to our runaway shelter and to our juvenile court. We have an assessment center. From there, those young people will move from that shelter and assessment center into long-term wraparound services so that we can catch them early enough before they get drug addicted, before they become traffic victims. So we're building this whole continuum of care. We're actually looking for the runaways. So instead of a street outreach project that we fund where someone goes out and they walk up and down the street and they might happen to bump into whoever, this is a more targeted where we're getting the names, the pictures, the intelligence, and sending officers to actually go look for them, recover them, and get them into services.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Let's see. One attendee is asking about cross-border activities. She says, can you share some information about good practices and solutions for dealing with cases of human trafficking in cross-border situations?
Yeah, I can speak about the U.S. I
Right.
can't speak about the other countries, but in the U.S., I think the best practice is to work, well, the U.S. has dispatched the Department of Homeland Security, otherwise known as ICE, to build a relationship with ethnic communities so that they can get intelligence so they can help rescue victims. So many of us who might be listening will see the flaw in that plan. ICE has notoriously not had a good relationship with ethnic communities across the US. And so we have had a horrible time getting relationships built between our ethnic communities and our government. And yes, our government is there to do good and there to help and not there to deport people, but it's a very scary time. And people don't want to come forward and tell anyone about someone being trafficked when it's the Department of Homeland Security. And so that's a serious issue. So what we've tried to do is build a relationship with our ethnic communities and with our ethnic agencies, ethnic-focused agencies, and get them to broker the deal between victims, intelligence on victims, and supplying information to the Department of Homeland Security. That is a little better, but that hasn't been working as well either because the ethnic-focused organizations don't want to be in the community seen as the people who are giving information to ICE. So we don't, in my opinion, and I'm just being as transparent as possible, I don't think that we have a good plan as of yet. I think we're rescuing victims, but our numbers in terms of international victims are very low. And I think the reason is because we have the wrong government agency involved.
Okay, all right, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. This attendee is asking about the penalties for trafficking crimes and if those have changed over the years. And also, as a second part to that, are there countries you know of that kind of have a high level of practice in terms of coordinating between law, social services, and medical to prevent and support victims?
Yeah, so the penalties have changed. They're getting stronger and longer sentences in prison for traffickers. Customers is where we need to really improve accountability. But in my community, about 10 years ago, there was someone that got 8 years for trafficking. And this year, someone got life. So we've really, and we have the luxury of following the federal law, prosecuting federally or prosecuting using the state law. So states have been passing their own laws. So if you have to use the state law, then it's the law may be all over the place. But we just prosecuted 3 pastors, yes, for trafficking in my community. 2 of the pastors got life in prison. 1 got 17 years. So the penalties can be, 15 years to life, or some communities might have 10 years, but it's certainly not a slap on the wrist. The other thing is to understand how well a country is doing. the U.S. does a trafficking in persons report or a tip report, and they do those annually, and it's free, it's online, and you can look up how the U.S. anyway has rated the country in terms of their efforts to fight trafficking. So if they're a tier 1 country, then they're doing a lot of great things and doing their best. And then tier 2 and tier 3. So tier 3 country not doing their best. And so you can read about each country and how well they're doing and where their weak areas are and where their strengths are.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you to our audience today for your questions, and again to Celia Williamson for being with us today. We would like to let you know that a recording of this webinar and a PDF version of the slides will be available within 24 hours on the ISPAN website. And also we will try to collect some of the resources Dr. Williamson referred to and post them on our new Human Trafficking Working Group page, which you can find on our, yes.
Heather, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I'm not sure if I provided my email, and I want to make sure I do that.
Oh, sure. Great.
So my email is Celia, CELIA, at CeliaWilliamson.com. That's CeliaWilliamson.com. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Great. And we will be giving Celia a list of the questions that were not, that we did not get to today. So she may be reaching out to you on that. So again, we will be posting some of these resources on our new Human Trafficking Working Group page on our website, which can be found on our homepage under the Global Connect tab. And then also in general, we just encourage all of you to become a member of ISPAN if you're not, so that we can continue having informational webinars like these in the future. And if you are interested in presenting or have ideas for topics for our webinar series, please contact us at resources@ispan.org. And if you're interested in getting information on the Human Trafficking Working Group, again, please visit that page on our website. Thank you again, everyone, for your time today, and to Celia Williamson for taking time to be with us. We hope that you all have a good day or night wherever you are. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.